seats. Committee members, I would invite you to take your seats. The clerk has advised me that we have a quorum and that the witness appearing virtually have been sound tested and has been approved. So with that, I call this meeting to order. Welcome to meeting number 131 of the Standing Committee on Human Resources, Skills, Social Development, and the Status of Persons with Disabilities. Today's meeting is taking place in a hybrid format according to House of Commons procedures and rules, meaning people are participating in person in the room as well as virtually. To all of you, you have the option of choosing to participate in the official language of your choice. In the room, interpretation services are available by choosing the language of choice on the using the headset in front of you, microphone. Those appearing virtually, click on the globe icon at the bottom of your surface and choose the official language of your choice. If there is a breakdown in translation, please get my attention by raising your hand. We'll suspend while it is being corrected. As well, a few operational ones. Please wait until I recognize you to speak. To get my attention, please raise your hand and I will recognize you. As well, any members appearing in the room with devices and surfaces, please turn alarms off or anything that may trigger a noise that can be picked up by the microphones because it can be harmful to the translators. As well, refrain from tapping on the microphone boom as well because it does pop the sound. With that, pursuant to Standing Order 1082 and the motion adopted by the committee on Thursday, June the 3rd, 2024, the committee is continuing its study on the advancements in home building technologies. I would like to now welcome our witnesses. We have two today for the first hour. We have Andy Berube, Vice President of Sales and Strategic Partnerships at BECC Modular Systems. Virtually, we have Mr. Stephen Smith, Executive Director, Center for Building in North America. I would advise each witness you have up to 5 minutes for your opening remarks. We'll begin with Mr. Berube. Berube or Berube?
Berube.
Berube.
Or Berube if you can say it in French.
Berube?
But that's difficult for me too.
Oh, okay. You have the floor, Mr.
Thank you. Good morning, everyone. And thank you, Mr. Chair and members of the Standing Committee for the opportunity to speak on this subject representing Beck Modular and the off-site construction industry. The home building technology and advancements in that field are critical, obviously. And I think we have 5 key points that we would like to kind of table today. One specifically is just standardization of design. The next is procurement policy. The third is enhanced collaboration. The fourth is education on building quality in the off-site industry. And the fifth is sustainable advantages. I think it's important to understand when we're talking about technology in construction or off-site construction, we can have the best technology in the world, but if the whole ecosystem is not in line, it doesn't matter about the technology. So the word technology is here, but it's important to understand it as an ecosystem in construction. So number one, standardization of design. I think that's a piece that as a construction industry, it's important that traditionally when you design something, a conventional construction process can actually build whatever an architect designs up front. When you're improving the process in any way, shape, or form, you have to look right back to the beginning and does the actual design that's being produced in a traditional manner work in a process where new advancements will be able to take advantage of that design. So improving the actual standardization across the board for the factories and coming up with a model that is not restrictive and specific to a factory, for example, but to a point where any factory can build from a standard, whether you're building with wood, steel, plastic, it does not matter. So can we get to an approach where a fundamental design helps everybody? Next is procurement policy. In a traditional method, again, if we're going to an advanced methodology that changes things, if you go to the traditional model of procurement, often we'll see what is called a design bid, which means you design something at an architectural level. And in a traditional sense, if you design it, there's a construction firm that can build it. Doesn't matter, because it's in situ, you've designed it, we can build it. But if you're trying to improve the entire life cycle of construction and expedite it or improve it in any way, what you end up doing is designing something that doesn't fit a model that's being created by the industry because it's being designed for a traditional sense. So the standardization that I think the federal government and CMHC is putting forward, I think is admirable. It's more complicated than just putting out a standard because you're dealing with land property and code differences, and is that design the same and can it go in different locations? Next is deeper collaboration between all levels of government. So an example, at the federal level, we have some fantastic policies being put in place, but unless it's at the provincial or municipal level, we continue to see roadblocks. So it's critical that we ask members of this committee to keep that in mind, to make sure that at all levels we're focused on the change that we're doing at one level. We continue through the other two levels of government. The fourth is education on offsite. And what we mean by that is often we run into the reality that when we're building, people are not educated in the fact that when you have an offsite production facility, it is a very stringent quality QA/QC process, and the CSA actually requires that. So the inspection at a site is very common, but it's also as common in a factory. So what we build in the factory is so what we're building in a factory is actually as good or better quality than at the site. So it's important on the education front that we're all, especially at the municipal or provincial level, that when there's a project going on, the quality in a factory is actually more rigid, more stringent than what's going on site. But we need to reduce the barriers because of a presumption that the quality is less. So it just slows down the process and costs everybody more, which is counterproductive. The fifth is sustainability. I don't think there's an industry that we're working in right now that doesn't have this top of mind. And when we're looking at offsite construction or the modular industry, everything that we do is as precise and as possible with less waste. You can go into a factory and you have a small trash bin. You go into a construction site and you have multiple trash bins. So the sustainability aspect of offsite construction and the technology that we're bringing is superior.
Bérubé, any other points you want? I'm sure you'll get the chance in the question session. We'll now turn to Mr. Smith for 5 minutes. Mr. Smith, you have the floor. You're on mute, Mr. Smith. Good.
Sorry about that.
Good.
All right, so thank you for having me here today. My name is Stephen Smith. I'm the Executive Director of the Center for Building in North America. We're a nonprofit organization based in New York City with the goal of conducting research about construction and building codes in the United States and Canada with a focus on global perspective. So my organization's research starts from the premise that demand for housing in the US and Canada has shifted over the last generation, and existing ways of building have not caught up. North America has a very unique construction culture, one that was well suited to sprawl. We developed techniques for affordably building single-family houses on greenfield sites, that is, sites that were not previously developed in an urban way. And this has served us very well in the 19th and 20th centuries. However, in the 21st century, we face new challenges. The climate and a strong demand for living in cities has meant that demand has turned inward, policy has turned inward into cities. More Canadians and Americans want to live in cities, and our construction culture has not caught up. A very unique feature of construction in North America, that is in the US and Canada, is that per square meter construction costs, sometimes called hard costs, rise as density rises. So a low-rise apartment building costs more to build per square meter than a single-family house, and a mid-rise apartment building costs more to build than a low-rise apartment building. This is a feature that I have not observed in other countries. I've looked in Italy, in Germany, and even in Mexico. And in those places, the cost of building is fairly consistent per square meter, whether you're building single-family houses or denser apartment buildings. So the implication of this is as demand and as planning policies lead to more urban construction, we face affordability challenges in construction that we do not know how to solve. Fortunately, there are other models. If we want to bring down the cost of urban construction, we can look to places where it doesn't cost any more to build apartments than it does houses. The most culturally and economically similar places to the US and Canada are in Europe. European nations have traditionally led the way in construction, whether we're talking about the use of mass timber, prefabrication, energy efficiency, or more efficient floor plans for tight urban sites. And fortunately, Canada and countries in Europe share a common history, climate, languages, and they're in similar economic situations. My research thus far has focused on elevators and stairways, but throughout building codes and the web of what are known as referenced standards, in areas from plumbing to windows, we can find similar themes. A North American tendency towards oversizing, a reluctance to look outside of our two countries for standards and solutions, and generally higher costs, especially for more urban kinds of construction. So we can get into more specifics during the questioning about codes, about standards, general approaches to construction and regulation. But my broad advice to Canada would be to try to resist the cultural pull of your larger neighbor to the south. I realize this is a bit ironic since I'm coming to you from the United States. And look instead to places that have had more success in implementing the goals you're trying to achieve. So building codes in Canada and the construction industry more generally tend to look to the United States, but this is not where you will find a record of success when it comes to building cities. When you think about affordable new urban housing, more family-friendly apartments, more energy-efficient homes, more innovative forms of construction, housing that is safe from fires, better mass transit, you won't find those things in America. So if you continue to emulate American models, you'll end up with American outcomes and probably will continue to be unhappy with the results. So anyway, thank you for inviting me, and I'm happy to answer any questions.
Thank you, Mr. Smith. Interesting comparison you gave. I'm sure it will be of interest to the members. We'll begin the first round of questions with Mr. Aitchison for 6 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I want to start quickly with Mr. Bérubé. Could you? Technology is amazing, and the technological abilities of a company like yours to produce buildings, multiple unit buildings at a really rapid rate. I'm sure you probably haven't come close to maxing out the potential of what you could produce. What's the biggest limitation to you maxing out production of units in your factories?
I think the analogy would be, if you could build the fastest car in the world and you don't have a road system, you're not going anywhere. So it's kind of to the theme of the 5 points that I have. You can have the technology, but you need the support and the understanding and the education of multiple people in the construction ecosystem to make sure it works. So I would say the biggest hurdle And there's offsite construction, modular, which we're playing in, but our partnerships and our clients, our developers, and everybody hears what they're saying about the policies, the roadblocks and the inefficiencies around trying to get things done. That's before the factory is ready to go, has gas in the car, but we're going out of business literally because of something that's happening down here. So you can put as much tech in the factory as you want, but if you don't have the support holistically, really, in all levels, we're not going anywhere.
You got to have a place to put those houses.
Exactly.
And it takes too long to get that approved. Okay, thanks for that. I'm sure others will have questions for you. I'd like to move over now to Mr. Smith. What you're working on is fascinating to me. There's all kinds of examples, I think, where United States and Canada, have got a whole different set of standards, and we make it more difficult to build and more costly to build than there is in Europe. I've read through your report on elevators, which, people would probably call me a nerd, but I found it fascinating about the different sizes of elevators in North America versus Europe. But I'm wondering if we could speak briefly, if you don't mind, Stephen, about stair policy and this concept that people might not understand, but single stair egress. Could you speak to that briefly for the community to understand what the issue is?
Sure. So, to get out of a building, you need at least one stairway, certainly. Historically, lower rise buildings tend to only have a single stairway. So the most lower rise would be a single family house, and there's only a single stairway. And as the building gets taller, naturally the egress requirements get more intense. Since you're farther from the ground, it's harder to rescue people. And this happens all over the world. However, in the United States, and in particular Canada, the requirements get very tight, very low to the ground. So in Canada, it is effectively impossible to build an apartment building with multiple stories with only a single stair. This sounds like a minor issue, but for a small urban site, it can be quite an imposition. I don't have data from Canada, but in the United States, prices are probably pretty similar. A 4-story stairway costs about a little over $200,000, depending on the market. I would assume is a similar price in Canada. For a larger building, for a site on a former, for a building on a former industrial site, maybe a commercial site where you have dozens of units on the floor, this is not a very high cost. But on a small lot, I know that cities across Canada are encouraging and allowing multifamily buildings on what were formerly single-family lots, for example. It can be quite an imposition. It can be quite a high cost. And there are all sorts.
I'm going to jump in here quickly. It's about cost, but is it also not about the lost opportunity for more rental units, for example, more housing units in that building?
Sure, it could be. I mean, it could be about more housing. It could be about more open space. A lot of people sort of oppose housing because it takes up a lot of the lot. You could, that's ultimately a planning decision, whether you'd want to replace it with, nothing at all and lower the cost, or replace it with housing and just, get more housing out of it. There's some technical considerations around that. But in general, I mean, it'll reduce the supply of housing the more building code requirements you load on. And some of them are necessary, but the stair, the second stair at such a low height is not considered to be necessary in any high-income country outside of Canada.
Do you think it's safe to say that in particularly Canada, and I guess the United States to some degree as well, that we don't take affordability into consideration enough in our building code review?
I would say that it's taken into strong account for single-family houses and to less account for denser forms of construction. And for a while, that was mostly what the US and Canada were building, single-family houses. But as we move to more multifamily typologies, I would say there's not as much of a focus on maybe the intent that is there for affordability, but the actual text and the policies can be quite expensive for multifamily house, can lead to quite expensive.
I think we have about 30 seconds left here. Give me, I was going to ask for 3 different changes you'd make to the code today, but maybe give me your top one.
Oh, the top one would be harmonization of standards, probably particularly with Europe. These are technical details that regulate anything from what kind of gypsum board you can use to what kind of elevators or windows you can buy.
Okay.
So don't look to the United States, harmonize globally. these
Thanks very much, sir.
Mr. Aitchison. Mr. Collins? For 6 minutes.
Yep, thanks, Mr. Chair. Mr. Berube, I'll start with you. I want to pick up on one of the last comments you made, and just in terms of the use of modular and getting your company and others to a point where you're at full capacity. And one of the challenges that I've found is that there are a lot of those within the industry and even those at all three levels of government who really aren't familiar with the benefits of modular housing. And so I look back to 2019, I was a city councillor. I had to bring a motion to my council to say, let's look at the benefits of modular and let's investigate a municipal nonprofit build for modular. I didn't know the pandemic was coming, and I didn't know that the federal government, before I arrived, was going to create the Rapid Housing Initiative, which forced municipalities to build in a very short time frame. And so my motion jived very well with that program, and our council said, we're going to build a modular build to take advantage of the Rapid Housing Initiative. If I look back, at the course of what happened over a 2-year period in my municipality, had it not been for the Rapid Housing Program or a motion, they probably wouldn't be even looking at modular, and now I think they're into their 6th or 7th project. So what can the federal government do in terms of encouraging or incentivizing? Rapid Housing Initiative is a great example, I think. What can we do to incentivize our municipal and provincial partners, as well as the private sector, to investigate or look at least and consider modular as an option when they're considering a residential housing build?
Well, I think one of the points that I talked about is just the barriers around the consistency across the 3 levels of government. So I think to answer your question, I think there needs to be consistency. Is there a point person at all levels that have this as their initiative? And do you speak collectively as one? Because a policy that's created at the federal level that's not aligned with the provincial or the municipal level doesn't make any sense. It stops the progress. So I would say that that's probably the number one piece. So at the factory level, I think we're doing our job in promoting the industry and expanding and discussing the benefits and the quality that what we build is better or the same as conventional construction. We're just doing it a lot faster, which has inherent benefits. It's the policies and assumptions around what we do that really is the roadblock. So it's the education and consistency across the governments.
Thanks for that. Mr. Smith, I was interested in I was on your website and I looked at the why we can't build family-size apartment units in North America. Again, I'll revert back to my municipal days. Just before I arrived here in Ottawa, worked on a public-private partnership with our municipal nonprofit. And we, in that partnership, we transferred the lands where we previously had just over 100 townhouse residential units, and we looked to consolidate those units in a higher density. You talked about infill, and of course, as municipalities and others look for sustainable developments, they look at higher densities. One of the challenges we had with higher densities and moving families into an apartment building was the cost of constructing family-sized apartment units. Can you provide some recommendations in terms of what the federal government can do to assist in bridging the gap with the whole issue of cost related to family-sized apartments?
I would say the most important thing the federal government could do, insofar as they control the building codes and, at least the model code process that eventually filters down, is slim down what are called the vertical circulation requirements. So the elevator requirements, the stair requirements. Obviously, you don't want to sacrifice safety, but you need to find the right balance. The more vertical circulation you require, the larger the building has to be. Strangely, generally the smaller the building, the easier it is to build family-sized apartments. So you want to make it easier to build small apartment buildings. As I understand, a number of cities and provinces are working on this. I think it should probably maybe move a little faster and be a little more ambitious. And then there's also planning reforms that should go along with it. I don't know the Canadian context well enough to know what role the federal government has there, but in general, you will find the most family-friendly apartments in any place in the lower density areas, and so you don't want to limit housing to only like very tall towers on very large sites. You'd want to open up some of these single-family neighborhoods to modest apartment buildings of 3 to 6 stories, and that's where it's always going to be easier to build family-sized apartments for a number of reasons.
Thanks for that. Mr. Berube, I got about a minute left, and I've toured Beck's facility in Ancaster. I was there for an announcement that we made. We, I think, provided just over $2 million to assist with some improvements that they were making at the plant. And I'm just curious to know, again, what do federal investments or any investments from any level of government mean to your business and your sector as it relates to improving with research and development and getting you to a point where those homes are being constructed faster in the factory and provided to the clients, whoever may choose to purchase them?
Great question. And funding, at any level is significant for a factory or any industry. Funding at a factory level is put towards labor itself, but also the technology. So if you're running a factory and you have, let's just call it 100 staff in there, and you can produce, 1 or 2 units fully finished a day, can you invest in the technology to stay at 100 and produce 4 or 5 or 10? And we look to Japanese and Scandinavian countries that have been doing that for 50 years, literally. And what they've done with their plants, and it's not always about robotics, it's just about systems and efficiencies, and it does cost money. So to grow and expand and to deliver quickly, you do need capital. So capital coming into the private sector from government is obviously well received and a huge benefit.
Thank you, Mr. Collins. Madame Chabot, pour 6 minutes.
6 minutes. Monsieur le Président, merci à nos...
Thank you, Chair. Thank you, witnesses. Mr. Berube, if I've understood correctly, your business is based in Ontario and you do prefabricated construction of buildings.
Sorry, we'll suspend for a moment.
Ontario business based in Ontario that provides prefabricated houses in mass timber. Is that what I am understanding?
We are structural steel, but we are based, our factory, in Ontario.
Bien, et vous me diriez...
Now, with respect to demand for the type of product that you produce, is there an increased demand for your product or not? Or is there an appetite for this type of model that you provide?
Absolutely, there is a demand, and it's increasing year over year. I've been in this business for 12, 13 years, and it hasn't slowed down, and the interest at all levels is increasing, and so yeah, we're in a fantastic industry. It's complicated, it's construction. In general, the industry itself is construction, and we need more houses. So we're just a part of the solution to build more houses.
Monsieur Berube, vous...
Mr. Berube, you're quite right to say that we need more construction to build more houses. Here in the committee, we have done several studies on that matter, and with respect to demand itself, we are doing some research to try to find solutions so that building becomes more affordable, whether it's a house or an apartment. Your technology and the way in which you produce your units, how can that contribute to making housing more affordable?
So I think there's 2 parts to that answer. One is at the factory level, just bringing in more technology and more systems to reduce a factory costs will in turn translate into lower costs on that side. Lowering the cost at the site, at the construction side, is really about a rapid delivery. So if you think about time is money, if you can build a building in the traditional sense in 2 years, if you can cut that in half or even to 3/4, if it's 15 months or 12 months, you have 5 to 6 to 7 months quicker, and time is money. Every month you're on the job, it costs everybody more money, and it creates more problems, and obviously less houses on the market.
Monsieur Ber-
Mr. Berube, you have spoken about the difficulties that exist, these obstacles, standardization, for example. I understand, but you did not speak about cohesion, uniformity, cooperation and collaboration amongst all levels of government. We do know that governments, whether it's Quebec or the other provinces, there are realities that are very much different in terms of the geography of the province, and that has an effect on the demand. I might be mistaken, but if you want wall-to-wall applications of something, if you want standardization, you would have to look at the territory of each province and of Quebec. So what does consistency mean to you then across the country?
Yeah, I think it is more complicated than just saying we're going to have a standard that works for everybody. And the more detail you get into, the more restricted you get, not only at the municipal level or the provincial level, because everybody has their own rules and regulations. It'll also restrict each factory. So if a particular factory, we're steel, if a particular factory is wood and it's more conducive, a project is more conducive to wood, and you have a standard that is so detailed that it stops the options in the market. So I'm not saying it's easy. I'm saying that there's got to be a balance between the standards of design that doesn't make it so restricted. It's so fundamental that it will work. It should work in, not, if it's not all, most provinces and territories. So there is a balance. But what is that common denominator? And that's really what needs to be understood at all levels. But yeah, it's not easy. I mean, we say a common design, but there's much deeper conversation than that.
Do I still have more time? Mr. Smith, very quickly then. Mr. Smith, very quickly. I will continue my line of questioning. I have great difficulty seeing the comparisons drawn between North America with this vast territory and the solutions that exist in Europe. I find that very, very interesting. I don't know if you'll have time to answer, but I see these as being very different. I would really like for you to expand on that, what could be done here in North America.
Short answer, Mr. Smith. You're on mute.
Sorry. I think they're often not as different as is painted. In Europe, there are many different countries, and one of the projects of European integration and cohesion has been standardizing across the continent from very high-income places like Switzerland, which isn't even in the European Union but typically follows EU standards, to low-income places like Romania, where my mother lives. You have vast differences in climate, from southern Italy to the top of Norway. And yet they have found a lot of ways to integrate within themselves. There are lots of places in Europe that have climates that are, like those in Canada. You have, similar languages. I think there are more similarities than differences. Fire burns the same, structures have the same properties, materials have the same properties. I think there are more similarities than is often portrayed in the construction industry in North America.
Thank you. Merci, Madame Chabot. Madame.
Thank you, Madame Chabot.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I'm going to ask Mr. Berube first, and I think about the fact that we're not operational, right? We're legislators, and what can we really do? So my focus is always life and safety in relation to this one. So I'm thinking about how do we need to modernize the federal code, and you mentioned about the standardization, which you also talked about how complex that is. I think about Vancouver, where in the 80s they did, or actually early 90s, they did the California Building Code on a number of multifamily buildings, and they didn't have rain screen. Their egresses are totally flooded all the time. So I'm just want to think about life and safety on a federal level. So what is the federal space in regards to life and safety when you talk about sustainability? And I think about climate change in my community. My community was the one where 2 people died with the atmospheric river recently. 1 house was washed away. Where does sustainability play in the federal code? And I'll add on top of that rural and remote communities, Indigenous communities, where we know housing is desperately, desperately needed. And how do we also roll in accessibility, persons with disabilities, aging population? Like, how could the federal government have a role in that life and safety focus?
Well, I think you already have that. And there's policies and procedures that, any method of construction has to follow around safety. And if we're, the specific code, that's not my expertise. But that code, whatever the policies are, we have to adhere to that in the factory. So with respect to the part of your question around disabilities or First Nations, it comes at the design level, and collaboration with the design to accommodate whatever we need with respect to safety is part of what we do. So when we're building something, if the design and the build needs to accommodate for a variety of different things in that particular jurisdiction or demographic, we build to the design. And we collaborate with the architects to design what's needed for that particular community, because it is different. I think it's fundamentally there.
It becomes a challenge because there are so many, I was hearing what you were saying about different materials that can be used, right? It might be the same design, different material. How do we give you the flexibility but still maintain the life and safety? And then who makes those decisions? That's what I'm struggling with.
And are you referring to more on the standardization of design, or are you just talking about how we build and the materials we build with?
I think that it's the standardization of design. If we have a federal code that says, let's talk about the egresses. The federal code says for this much square footage, you need 2 egress, right? Is that detailed enough or not, or too detailed when you go to manufacture something and you have to think about where it's going to be, where it's going to be placed, how it's going to get there, what is the transportation capabilities, what's the labor that is available in that area? Like, there's just so many factors. What can the federal government really play when there's so much that needs to be done to get it built on site?
I think it does circle back to the federal government can actually communicate more effectively or align with the different levels of government, right? We as a factory, whether it be conventional or off-site construction, can build to whatever that policy is set up. But the challenge is the policy and that you set up here is not consistent. So we can be ready to do whatever you want. We're ready, but it doesn't happen fast enough because of the lack of alignment between the government. So
that's interesting to me, because I wonder, is the federal code too restrictive, and should the federal code really be focused on more of a narrow health, life and safety?
Possibly.
All right, I'm going to go to our second witness, and I am interested in this this egress. You said you'd done a lot of work on elevators and stairwells, and in BC, the BC government just recently approved the ability to have single egress, but the disability community is really very concerned about it, and so are the BC fire chiefs. So they're writing to the provincial government saying, hey, this hasn't been thoroughly thought out and coded, but I want to just quote a very high-profile disability advocate in BC. And she said that the province's building code change does not take into account disability or old age. especially given BC had mandated that single-stair buildings not be put in seniors' residence. And it reminds me of when I was in China and in a seniors' residence, and there was no elevators, no way to get them out, and the workers were actually putting the seniors on their backs to get them up and downstairs. So I'm just wondering what your thoughts are on these comments from Disability Advocate, and also the fact that the BC fire chiefs are saying that this isn't a good idea on single egress.
So in regards to the disability, I think there's sometimes some confusion. Single exit refers to specifically what's known in building codes as the exit, which is the stairway. It doesn't speak to how many elevators or whether or not there should be an elevator. My understanding is that building codes in Canada, at least for I think what's called Part 3 buildings, that is larger buildings, generally require elevators, and those would remain required. A general fact about housing is that newer housing is always more accessible, not just more accessible, but generally safer in every way than older housing. And the details of how you regulate the newer housing are not quite as important as new versus old. So to take the concrete example, older housing in British Columbia and Vancouver, for example, probably is much less likely to have an elevator at all. It's much less likely to have step-free thresholds to get in and out of the units. The actual standards are much lower. The actual standards, the clearances and such, to turn wheelchairs or whatever in the kitchens or bathrooms were much lower back then. So you have to weigh the smaller details of new construction against all of the improvements that you get in a new building to begin with.
Thank you, Mr. Smith. Madame Zarillo, we're well over time. You may want to finish that thought process in another question, Mr. Smith, but we'll go to Ms. Gray for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you to all of the witnesses for being here. My first questions are for Mr. Smith. Mr. Smith, a Canadian architectural company, Real Space 3D, wrote in an article on their website, building codes, while essential for safety and sustainability, can significantly influence construction costs in Canada. Compliance often requires additional materials, specialized labor, and time-consuming administrative processes, all contributing to higher housing prices, unquote. Would you agree with the statement, and is Canada an outlier when it comes to our building codes adding unnecessary cost to construction?
I mean, it's a pretty general statement, so that's pretty easy to agree with, I say. Yes, and specifically, so like something I said earlier, specifically with regards to multifamily housing, yes, Canada is an outlier. And the cost curve as you go from single family to low-rise multifamily to mid-rise multifamily, it's quite steep in Canada compared to other places, actually more so than even in the United States, but especially compared to countries outside of North America.
Thank you. Mr. Smith, several not-for-profit organizations who build affordable housing have been before this committee talking about the Liberal government's federal housing agency having burdensome regulatory requirements more than what standard building codes require, resulting in delays and cost increases. And based on your experience, is burdensome red tape and regulation at the federal level and at others undermining the ability of Canada to build more affordable housing units?
I think I could agree with that. I would say, in general, most of what's in a building code and most of this regulation is sound. However, there are elements that I think go overboard in multifamily housing in particular. I don't want to throw the baby out with the bathwater and be like too anti-regulation. And in a lot of ways, I think regulations could stand to be a bit stricter, but in other ways not. So I guess what I would advocate for is a different framework, not necessarily a more or less, although, certainly in certain areas there should probably be a bit less.
Thank you. Mr. Smith, is it wise to layer a building code with new regulations, red tape or bureaucracy if they don't necessarily improve building safety or increase accessibility, for example, but only increase the cost to build? Do you have any thoughts on that?
Oh, well, I mean, taking the question for granted, certainly that would be a very bad idea. Some of the difficulty is in knowing exactly what's going to increase safety and what's not. The buildings have gotten so complicated, and when you're writing codes, especially on a municipal or provincial level, but honestly, even on a national level, it can be difficult, which is why I think it's important to look to international standards where these have been vetted in a much wider community, because as you start to, take it down to more local places, your resources to weigh the costs and the benefits and to investigate even what the costs and benefits are really start to diminish. It can be very difficult to do this in a small jurisdiction, and you end up sort of going based on instinct and opinions rather than science.
Thank you. And Mr. Smith, you had just talked about international standards, and in comparison to other jurisdictions, and I know you're very familiar with European jurisdictions in particular, in your opinion, where does Canada's National Building Code and standards rank in assisting to deliver affordable homes in Canada?
For multifamily in particular, I think quite low. And I was looking through the National Building Code of Canada today and looking at the reference standards, and you guys are referencing a lot of US and Canadian standards and not so many international ones.
Do you have any specific recommendations that you can provide that might be international standards that Canada might want to consider?
Oh, it's difficult to say in any particular one because, a building is made up of so many different parts, and each one is sort of a de minimis cost, which is sort of how these costs increase, because you say, well, it's just a little thing here and there. It's just a little part of the building. What does it really matter? An elevator, for example, it's only 2% of the total cost of construction. But really, you find these in the entire building. So it's hard for me to isolate just one or the other. I mean, the things that I know about, there's, ventilation and plumbing that goes a bit overkill. I know a lot about elevators. I know a lot about stairways. You have separate standards for windows. It's every part of the building. So it's hard to isolate just one. I guess my general recommendation would be to go through the building code systematically and look for differences in the global standards, which tend to derive from the European ones, and try to fix them all ideally, which is really the task of a lifetime, but I think needs to be done. It's hard to pick just one. I know the ones that I've studied, but that's not to say these are necessarily even the most important ones. They're just the ones that, with limited resources I've looked into.
Thank you, Ms. Gray. We'll go to Mr. Coteau for 5 minutes.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair, and thank you so much to our witnesses today. I'll start with Mr. Smith. The national building codes that you made reference to are they're not specific law, but recommendations to provinces, and it's up to them to adopt their own, specific building codes. Is that correct from your perspective?
Sorry. My general, I don't know the specifics very well. You should probably ask a Canadian, but my general understanding is, yes, they're model codes, and then the provinces can.
Understanding of these building codes that we're talking about, the federal government puts out recommendations, and provinces can actually adopt them. They come from the National Research Council. So it's really up to provinces and territories to design their own specific codes when it comes to fire, health and safety, accessibility, energy efficiency, et cetera. One of the challenges we have, and I don't know how it works in the States, but in the States, does the National Building Code, are they actual law and govern the entirety of the United States, or are states responsible for their own codes like in Canada?
In general, states and cities are responsible for their own codes. The national one, which is actually not even written by government in the United States, is just a model to follow. And most of the time, like in Canada, I believe it is followed. But yes, states and cities ultimately have the authority, and they are what determines.
So just just because it was, I think there is a tone being set that the federal government's responsible for all of these codes in law, and it's federal regulation or law that's actually slowing things down. These are just recommendations. I just wanted to mention that. The other thing I wanted to mention, the European North American comparison. Canada, like the United States, when they started to build cities, it wasn't too long ago. In the UK or in Europe, some of these cities are 1,000+ years old. How do you compare like a city like in Yorkshire, England, where the infrastructures remained the same for 500-600 years? How do you compare that to Ottawa?
Europe was heavily damaged during World War II. There are countries, especially in Southern Europe, where as a tourist, you go into these ancient city centers, but most of the housing stock in a place like Spain or Italy is actually quite new. So I don't think that the age is actually all that different. As a tourist, of course, you don't want to visit some 1960s suburb of Madrid. You want to visit the beautiful little city center. But, most Europeans are not living in, 300-year-old buildings. They're living in, much newer ones.
Right. I'll go to Mr. Berube. Did I say it right?
Perfect.
Okay, thank you so much. Thank you for being here. I know that you said that there's some growth that's occurring in your sector. How, when you talk about the growth, for a company that might, represent a lot of growth, but for Canadians and development in our country as a whole, do you see your sector spreading rapidly across the housing sector, or is it just how is it? Take a minute just to explain how large this sector is within housing.
I would say the demand is increasing, the growth is stagnant, and I'm probably exaggerating the stagnant part of it. We're growing as an industry, and we're building more and more off-site, just shortening time frames around construction. But the demand is increasing rapidly just because the population, the trades, people aren't going into the trades. We don't have people to build. So what is the solution? You can't make people. Well, you can, but you can't force your kids to be a tradesperson. So at the factory level, we're able to help resolve a problem around labor in the market. So it's one of the reasons we go. So I think that's that's a picture of the industry and the growth part of it. The demand is there, but we're stagnant because of the organization in total. And you made a comment earlier about the federal government being responsible. I would say that they're not necessarily responsible, but they should be supportive and encouraging, setting the tone.
I agree.
And educating and putting out the understanding that if you put a policy or a suggestion in place to provincial or municipal, if they're not, they're just contributing to the problem.
Thank you.
I've run out of time already. Thank you so much.
Talk a little bit over. I'm generous today. Madame Chabot pour 2 minutes.
Madame Chabot, 2.5 minutes. Well, first of all, I would like to thank our witnesses. This is a very interesting discussion. On your internet site, sir, and it's translated into French, are buildings, and you're talking about the United States and Canada on your website, are energy efficient and modern. Can you tell us what you could do to improve the situation? That is to say, expand on what you have done.
Sorry about that. How do I expand on this? I guess, okay, so I guess what I've said is to, look more towards other countries outside of North America. The United States, which is traditionally what Canadian codes have looked to, has not historically been that concerned about energy efficiency. There are, far better models in other places. And in fact, there are many features of the buildings which are not even specifically about energy efficiency, but which raise the amount of space that needs to be heated and cooled, or reduces the the efficiency of the building envelope. And once you reach a certain level of efficiency, you need to do things that increase the costs. But if you're starting from a fairly inefficient baseline, a building that has 2 stairs where only 1 are necessary, a building that has an older type of elevator where a new one is possible, you can find things that are both cost savings and energy reducing, and these things are not in tension. So if you're starting from a low baseline, as the United States certainly is, and I believe Canada is as well, I think you can find things that, you know, meet both objectives. But I'm sorry to repeat the same thing over and over, but I think it's really important to look outside of this country, outside of these two countries, to find these models. Hopefully I answered your question. I apologize if I repeated myself or it was a little too general.
Chabot? Fini, madame.
It's time over, Madame Chabot. Madame Zirillo.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So I'm going to go back to Mr. Berube and Berube on the French. My question is, how can the federal government modernize or even keep current with the emerging technologies and assist in getting affordable, accessible, climate-resilient housing built?
How can you help? So I think as far as the requirements to be more sustainable, there was, I can't remember the question that came out, but the more you drive the requirements of things that are not critical, it does drive the cost of construction up. Even the word affordable housing has nothing to do with somebody finding a secret spot to buy a cheaper piece of 2x4. So driving the numbers up with just wanting to be more sustainable, we do need to. And I think the industry as a whole, private industry, is bringing in technology to improve the current state. But if you get to the point where everything is so restricted and driven towards improving, you can always improve. You can always improve. But the cost associated with that improvement, is it necessary? Is it broken? And if it's not, you really have to question why you're adding costs to it. So I hope I answered your question.
Does your technology and your solution assist with getting those accessible, climate resilient, and accessible and affordable? Like, does your solution help in some of that antiquated thinking and some of those antiquated?
Yeah, as far as the accessible, that's a design thing. We, as a construction industry or modular offsite industry, putting something to be accessible is just a matter of design. Everybody can do that. You know, that's just following code to whatever the requirements are for accessibility. The sustainability part, for sure, at our factory, it's how do we reduce the cost and reduce the waste.
I'm interested in the waste. How does it reduce waste for what are your experiences on waste reduction?
For example, what we're looking at within our specific factory is the time it takes us to do one beam today is 8 hours. What we're looking at to improve is creating the same beam, steel beam, in 30 minutes. So just the reduction of time and what we have to do with welding or securing that piece, that's the difference. So we're going from 8 hours to 30 minutes.
Thank you, Ms. Zirillo. We'll conclude with Ms. Falk and Mr. Van Bynen. Take us a little over, but we have an hour for committee business. So, Ms. Falk, for 5 minutes.
Thank you very much, Chair, and thank you to both the witnesses for being here today. So, during this study, we have heard that most building code changes drive up the price of home building and that those added costs can make it difficult for home builders to innovate or to consider using new technologies. Mr. Smith, if I can start with you, I know that you had mentioned the government could harmonize standards within code. I'm just wondering if there's any other suggestions that you have that the government could do to ensure that affordability and cost effectiveness are factored into building codes. Is there anything else other than harmonization?
I think something that I would like to see more of in the US and Canada is research by the government into the costs and benefits of various changes. I've found that the level of study that goes into some changes really like having done some of it myself, really leaves a lot to be desired. And I can't speak so specifically to the Canadian context. However, in the US context, the way that these codes are written are often a bunch of unpaid volunteers sort of in a room puzzling things out together. And it often does not, if you're trying to evaluate the costs and the benefits, it doesn't do a great job of doing that in a very precise way. And if you don't understand the costs and you don't understand the benefits, it's hard to balance them very well.
When you
So I
say,
would like to see.
sorry, excuse me, when you say volunteers, what type of background do these people have? Are they experienced in that field, or are they academics?
They're certainly experienced in the field, not very many academics. I think bringing in academics to the conversation would be a lot better. They're experienced in the field. Some of them have vested interests. They might work for a material manufacturer. Others of them work for the fire service, a building official, something like that. But you know, a bunch of people in a room talking like we are does not get you to a high level of precision. And at some point, you need to sort of devote resources to it and understanding exactly what you're dealing with. What are the costs? What are the benefits? And I find that's often lacking in the United States. I would imagine in Canada as well, but I don't know it specifically enough to say.
Okay, thank you. Mr. Barabé, thank you for being here. I just have a question around government input costs. So we have heard, just at our last meeting, these input costs like the carbon tax has impacted the feasibility of some of construction projects that would be considered or may not be considered given the carbon tax. Would you agree with that?
Yeah, I think any change that's going to drive the numbers up, it's just fundamentally it makes a difference in construction. So whether it's a sustainable change, you know, we want to go passive or Title 24 or triple net, whatever that policy, if it creates a scenario where we can build it, it's not a question of whether the construction industry can build it. It's just the construction industry can build it. It's just driving the numbers up.
So
all
is
the
it fair to
changes-
say that any increase in taxes would
Of course.
would affect the feasibility of that?
Absolutely.
Also, too, I have a question because when Madame Chabot had asked about materials that you use, and you're using steel, has the carbon tax affected your ability to get the recycled steel? We know that there's less being manufactured. It's very expensive given this carbon tax that's been imposed on industry. Is that affecting your ability to get things built or being able to get product? Because I think from what I understand, you're using recycled steel. Is that correct?
It depends on what we're building.
Okay.
It really does. But again, it just comes down to if there's regulations being imposed, it typically will drive numbers up. So you really have to look at.
So since the carbon tax has been implemented and forced in some provinces in this country, has that affected? Have you noticed a difference in?
I can't speak to that specifically for our facility, but if it relates to steel carbon tax, we will. If we're not building in a particular province, yes, it will.
I know talking to the steel manufacturers in Saskatchewan at the Evraz plant, they have huge issue with this and see it as the carbon tax as a detriment to their livelihoods and being able to produce steel. So I would just make the assumption that it would affect anybody that needs that product, right? Correct. Yeah, okay. Okay, thank you very much.
Welcome.
Thank you, Ms. Falk. We will conclude with Mr. Van Bynen for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. We've learned an awful lot in the number of witnesses that we've received during the study. And I'm certainly interested in the options that you're offering. Through our government's industrial strategy on home building, we are investing in new models of home building technology that will rapidly increase the housing supply. Can you further develop the model that you've put together and how you have innovated to cut down on building times?
How has
How's
our
your
factory
operations? Yeah, how does that help?
specifically, how have you helped, or what are we doing?
What are you doing? What's the model? What's your business model provide in terms of reducing the construction time of the house?
Yeah, that's, I think, a very key focus for every factory. Ours, obviously, our system right now, I can say that we're looking to the global market to bring in technology and partnerships that have been doing this for years. And for us, we're forecasting, where we can produce 2 fully finished modules per day. We're going to get to 10, 20 finished modules per day. So it's I can't get into specifics, but every factory, speaking on behalf of the industry, is always looking at how do we produce faster.
Some of the other models that we'd heard was effectively a house in a box. So you put it on a trailer and you construct on site. Is that what your business model is as well?
House on a box? Sorry.
Well, it was referred to a house in a box where they effectively put all of the components of the unit onto a flat bed truck, take it to the site, and construct there.
Yes, volumetric construction. Sure, volumetric just means you're building a module where your interior is fully finished, which expedites the construction at site. So you build it in tandem. The site work is done in tandem with the second or fourth floor or fifth floor. So when you finish this part of it is already done, so you're combining them to expedite it. So our facility is a volumetric modular structural steel modular factory.
You send units out and put them on the site. So how does that compare or contrast with the traditional forms of home building? How much time are we saving?
I don't think we're at 50% reduction just because of the system, the collaboration and the education and how we're getting better and better. But I think we're certainly at 30%, and there's a lot of room to improve. Just as we collaborate as from a factory, the design, the construction, and the development side, and the capital partners that go along with the whole construction ecosystem. Once that continues to evolve and get better, I think the industry believes that we're at 50% reduction in speed.
So if we were to do an end-for-end analysis, it seems to me that a large part of the barriers lay in the approval processes and taking raw land to the point where there's a foundation that... Is that the way you see it? And have you had any experience on how we might expedite the process from raw land to foundation?
It is the way the industry and we see it, and it's really the front end, the developers that we work for that want to build on that property that is impacted the most, right? Because they have to go through the entitlement process, the permitting process. So I think what we're talking about today is removing those barriers and being more consistent across multiple layers of government will help that, reducing the costs associated with it and the steps. And I think that question is probably better served to a developer that has to deal with that every day. We're ready to go. They can't.
Would you say that this committee should more effectively be spending some time on how do we get through the barriers that take raw land to the foundation?
Absolutely.
Okay, thank you. And where there are certain directions that we need to give some thought to provide incentives. So are there any certain directions for investment that you would encourage for others to pursue that might help the industry and that might help our objectives?
Yeah, I think specifically in the off-site, there is a difference in the draw for the project, meaning in a conventional project, you draw small amounts continually, and everybody is used to that. Banks, capital partners understand that. In off-site construction, if you think about, we're doing floor 2 to 10, and floor like 1 and 2, for example, is a podium. We acquire the entire building on day one. We don't buy parts and draw from a fund. So as far as understanding how to solve the problem of funding a model where we, as a factory, buy everything today because it's so rapid to run through and finish, we need the majority of our money to build up front. So that's a big problem to be solved.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Van Bynen. So on behalf of the committee, thank you, Mr. Smith, for joining us virtually for today's meeting, as well as Mr. Berube for coming in and providing your testimony to this particular study. So at this, we'll suspend for 5 minutes while we transition to an in-camera session to do committee business. So Mr. Smith, you are free to go, as well as Mr. Berube. We'll suspend for 5 minutes. Suspend.